The mockery begins, a human against the unknown. Ethan stood at the edge of the ancient spaceship, gazing out into the vast emptiness of space. The ship was old, older than any human technology he'd ever seen. It was covered in layers of dust and debris, hidden in the deepest corner of the galaxy. But here he was, a human, standing in front of it, ready to explore the unknown. His mission was clear: recover any useful technology, gather information, and bring it back to Earth. Earth, which was still considered insignificant by most of the galaxy's advanced civilizations. Humanity was nothing more than a primitive species, too weak to be of any real threat or value. The ship had been lost for centuries, forgotten by time. But now it had been found. By him. Ethan's heart raced with excitement as he stepped forward, his boots crunching on the old metal beneath him. He was alone. The other members of the exploration team had stayed behind on the mothership, afraid to venture out into the unknown. But Ethan wasn't afraid. He had always been different. He had always believed the humans had something more to offer than the galaxy gave them credit for. As he entered the ship, the air was thick with dust and silence. It smelled of metal and age, the scent of a forgotten era. The walls were covered with strange markings, symbols that didn't make sense to him. They looked like a language, but one too old for even the most advanced human translators to decode. Ethan pulled out his scanner and began to search the ship. His device beeped softly as it picked up strange readings, unusual energy signatures, and pieces of technology that seemed way beyond anything humanity had developed. His eyes widened as he moved deeper into the ship, his fingers brushing over the intricate designs on the walls. It was clear this was no ordinary vessel. The moment he stepped into the central chamber, he felt a chill. The room was large, its walls lined with strange machines and pieces of technology that hummed faintly. But at the center of it all, there was something else, a pedestal glowing with an eerie light, and upon it rested an object, a weapon, by the looks of it. Ethan approached it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The weapon was crafted from a material that looked almost alive, glowing with an otherworldly energy. It was too perfect, too advanced for his mind to fully comprehend. Yet, somehow, he could feel its power calling to him. Just as Ethan reached out to touch it, a voice echoed through the room. It wasn't human. "You think you can use that?" The voice scoffed. It was cold, mocking. Ethan froze, looking around the room. There was no one there, yet the voice felt so real. He glanced at his communication device, but there was no signal. The voice came again, this time louder, more mocking. "You, a primitive human, think you can control such power? How amusing," the voice continued, dripping with contempt. "Do you not understand that you are nothing compared to the civilizations of the galaxy? You are weak, unworthy." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. The aliens who spoke were not just any beings. They were part of a highly advanced intergalactic council that ruled over countless star systems. They had observed humanity from afar and deemed them insignificant, a species too undeveloped to matter. To them, humans were nothing more than a curiosity. But Ethan wasn't going to let their mockery stop him. He had spent his entire life studying alien technologies, learning from their discoveries. He knew that humans had something they didn't, something that couldn't be measured by technology or advanced civilizations: determination. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, reaching out to grasp the weapon. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a surge of energy shot through his body, causing his entire frame to tremble. The room seemed to pulse with power, the air thick with the hum of something ancient and unstoppable. But then the mocking voice returned, this time tinged with a hint of fear. "No, it can't be," the voice whispered. You've activated it." Ethan's heart raced as the weapon in his hand began to glow brighter, a fierce, almost blinding light emanating from it. He could feel the power surging within him, coursing through his veins, unlike anything he had ever experienced. The alien voice was silent for a moment, and then it spoke again, more urgently this time. You cannot control it. No human ever could. The voice was now filled with panic. Put it down. You don't understand what you've... But it was too late. Ethan could feel it now, the power of the weapon. He didn't understand it completely, but he didn't need to. All he knew was that it was far stronger than anything the aliens could imagine, stronger than anything humanity had ever faced. The mockery that had started as laughter, as derision, was now fading. The aliens had underestimated humanity. They had mocked him for being human, for being weak. But they hadn't counted on this. Ethan didn't need to understand the weapon fully. He didn't need to know its origins or its purpose. What mattered now was that he had it, and with it, humanity had a chance to rise above the galaxy's scorn. As the weapon's light continued to pulse in his hands, Ethan knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. The universe would soon realize that humanity was far more than just a primitive species, and that the laughter of the aliens would turn to fear. The awakening, unleashing the power within. The blinding light that erupted from the weapon in Ethan's hand slowly faded, but its power remained, radiating from the core of the device. The air around him seemed to thrum with energy, vibrating as if the entire ship was alive and reacting to what had just occurred. Ethan stood still, his heart racing, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. The mocking voice of the aliens had gone silent, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if they had realized the gravity of the situation. He could feel the weight of their gaze, even though they were not physically present. Their presence was everywhere, an invisible force that hung heavy in the air. But Ethan didn't care. He had the weapon now. And with it, everything was different. Ethan took a cautious step forward, still holding the weapon tightly in his hands. The ship around him was dark, the walls covered with ancient, unknown symbols. He didn't have much time. He had to figure out how to use the weapon, and more importantly, how to survive in the face of the inevitable confrontation that was coming. He had no idea what the weapon was or how it worked, but he could feel its immense power. He could feel it in his bones, in the very air he breathed. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The aliens had made a mistake. They had underestimated humanity. And now, Ethan had something far more dangerous than any of them could imagine. Suddenly, the ship's systems began to activate. The hum of ancient machinery filled the room, and lights flickered to life. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he turned, trying to make sense of what was happening. The ship was waking up. It was responding to the weapon's activation. Was it a trap, or had he just unlocked something far greater than he had ever anticipated? He quickly accessed his communicator, but there was no signal. The technology on the ship was too old, and the alien systems were too advanced. The only way forward was to keep moving, to explore and understand the weapon that had now become a part of him. As Ethan walked deeper into the ship's corridors, he could feel the tension growing. It was like the walls themselves were alive, sensing his every step. The ship, once a forgotten relic, had been activated by the very weapon he now held in his hands. But what would it mean for him? And what would it mean for humanity? Ethan didn't know, but he had no choice but to keep going. The alien response. Panic spreads. Back in the depths of their hidden base, the alien species who had watched Ethan with derision were beginning to feel something they had never experienced before. Fear. They had underestimated the human. They had laughed at his weakness, believing that no primitive species could ever possess anything that would threaten their vast empire. But now, as they monitored the ship, they could see the weapon in Ethan's hands glowing with an intensity that they had not anticipated. The ancient weapon was far more powerful than they could have imagined, and it was reacting to the human, something they could not explain. The weapon, it's alive, one of the alien commanders muttered in disbelief. He paced nervously in the control room, watching the monitors as they displayed Ethan's movements on the ship. This cannot be. No human should have access to this. But how? Another alien voice responded. The weapon should have been dormant, lost in time. No one, not even us, should have been able to activate it. The first alien turned, his eyes burning with frustration and fear. It doesn't matter how he did it. What matters is that he has it now. And with it, he poses a threat to everything we've built. The aliens had thought they controlled the galaxy. They thought they could dictate the fates of all species, even those far beyond the reaches of Earth. But now, with the power of this ancient weapon in the hands of a human, everything was about to change. Ethan, a single human, had done the unthinkable. He had not only found the weapon, but had unlocked its true potential. And now, the galaxy would have to reckon with the consequences. The weapon's power, unfolding mystery. Ethan's steps echoed in the quiet halls of the ship as he continued to explore. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle of what he had discovered. The weapon in his hands was more than just a tool. It was a key. But to what? What was it meant to unlock? And why was it so important that it had been hidden away for so long? He walked through the narrow passageways, his senses heightened. Every corner he turned, every shadow that flickered, felt like a threat. But Ethan knew he couldn't stop now. The aliens might have mocked him before, but they weren't laughing anymore. And neither was he. Suddenly, he felt a strange sensation, as if the weapon was responding to something outside the ship. He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. The power inside the weapon seemed to swell, its energy building to a terrifying crescendo. Ethan tightened his grip, but he knew something was coming. Then, a voice echoed in his head, a voice that wasn't his own. "Human, you have no idea what you've awakened." Ethan's body froze. The voice was familiar, yet foreign at the same time. It was deep, otherworldly, and filled with an ancient wisdom. The weapon, it seemed, had a mind of its own, and it was not speaking to him like an object. It was speaking to him as if it were alive. What is this?" Ethan whispered to himself, his mind reeling with questions. The voice continued, its tone shifting between pity and warning. "You've activated the weapon, human. But the true test is yet to come. You must prepare yourself. There are others who will come for it, and they will stop at nothing to take it from you." Ethan's grip tightened around the weapon. He didn't know who or what would come after him, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. The fate of humanity, and the galaxy, was now in his hands. The first confrontation. A deadly pursuit. Ethan's breath came in short bursts as the voice echoed in his mind, its words heavy with the weight of an impending doom. "You must prepare yourself." The warning reverberated, growing louder as if the ship itself was amplifying the urgency of the situation. But what did it mean? Who were they? And why were they after the weapon? The ship's corridors felt endless now, the walls pressing in closer with each step. He tightened his grip on the weapon, every sense alert to the sounds around him. The strange power within the weapon pulsed beneath his fingers as if it had a life of its own, guiding him, or perhaps warning him. Suddenly, a sharp metallic hiss sliced through the silence. Ethan spun around, weapon raised, his pulse racing. Shadows danced along the walls as if something, or someone, was moving just out of sight. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he knew that wouldn't be an option. Whatever was coming for him, it was inevitable, and it was here. The air seemed to grow colder as something large shifted in the darkness. Ethan could hear the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, echoing from deeper within the ship. He was being hunted. The aliens hadn't just underestimated him. They had sent something far more dangerous. The true threat was now on its way. Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing for a plan. There was no turning back. He had to face whatever was lurking in the shadows. He took a deep breath and steadied himself, trying to push past the terror that gripped his chest. With a quick motion, he activated the weapon. The ancient gun hummed to life, a deep vibration coursing through Ethan's body. The air around him crackled with energy, and for a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Then the floor beneath his feet rumbled, and the ship's lights flickered ominously. From the darkness emerged the first of the creatures, a hulking alien predator, its glowing eyes locked onto Ethan. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. Its form was sleek yet muscular, covered in scales that shimmered like liquid metal. A pair of razor-sharp claws extended from its forearms, gleaming in the dim light. Ethan's pulse quickened. This was no ordinary alien. This was the true face of the threat he had awakened. The predator growled, its low voice vibrating in the air. Ethan didn't hesitate. He raised the weapon, its power still thrumming in his hand, and aimed. But before he could fire, the creature lunged with terrifying speed, closing the distance between them in an instant. Instinctively, Ethan sidestepped, barely avoiding the sharp claws that slashed through the air. The predator's speed was unreal, but the weapon in his hand seemed to recognize the danger, guiding his movements as though it were connected to him. The ancient tech pulsed in response to the alien's movements, as if it too was learning from the encounter. He fired. A bolt of brilliant energy shot from the weapon, crashing into the predator's chest. The impact was immediate and violent. The creature screeched, its body spasming as it was thrown back, crashing into the walls of the corridor with a sickening thud. The force of the blast had sent it reeling, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The predator growled in anger, struggling to rise. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't give up. He could see the creature was still alive, but it was wounded. The weapon had done damage that the alien couldn't easily recover from. He fired again, this time more carefully, aiming at the creature's exposed underbelly. Another burst of energy erupted from the weapon, this time with even more power behind it. The predator's body convulsed before it crumpled to the floor, motionless. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The threat had been eliminated, but he knew this was only the beginning. There would be more. The aliens had sent this predator for a reason, and they wouldn't stop until they had the weapon, or him. The ship's corridors suddenly felt more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of the danger pressing down on him. His every step was cautious now. The first confrontation had been brutal, but it had given him something more: confidence. The weapon was powerful, far beyond anything he could have imagined. But with that power came responsibility, and he had to be ready for whatever came next. The voice in his head stirred once again. "The path is set," it said. "You have awakened the first of many." Ethan's grip tightened around the weapon. He had no idea what was coming next, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to keep moving. The stakes were higher now, and the fate of humanity depended on his every decision. The unseen enemy, the truth behind the weapon. Ethan's mind raced as he moved deeper into the abandoned spaceship, the air growing colder with each step. The battle with the alien predator had left him breathless, but it had also ignited a burning curiosity within him. The weapon he wielded, this ancient, powerful tool, was more than just a means of defense. It was a key to something far greater, something he still didn't fully understand. The walls of the ship seemed to pulse with a low, rhythmic hum, as though it were alive. The silence of space enveloped him, broken only by the occasional creak of the ship's structure. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The encounter with the predator had only confirmed his suspicions. There was something far bigger at play here. The aliens weren't just after the weapon. They were after him too. As he moved through the dark corridors, he came across a massive door, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. It was as if the ship itself was guiding him toward this moment. The weapon pulsed in his hand, its power surging in response to the door. He could feel the connection. Whatever lay beyond this threshold was crucial to understanding the full extent of the weapon's purpose. Ethan hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a vast chamber beyond. Inside, the floor was covered in strange markings, lines that crisscrossed in intricate patterns. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it lay a device that looked eerily similar to the weapon he held. But this was different. It was larger, more intricate, and it exuded a dark, foreboding energy. He approached the pedestal cautiously, every instinct telling him that this was not just a weapon, but a relic of unimaginable power. The symbols on the floor seemed to pulse with the same energy as the weapon, and Ethan felt the weight of history pressing down on him. This device was not just a tool for destruction. It was a key to understanding the very fabric of the universe. As his hand reached for the device, a voice suddenly echoed in his mind. "Do not touch it." Ethan froze, his heart skipping a beat. The voice wasn't his own. It was alien, distant, yet somehow familiar. It sent a chill down his spine. He turned, expecting to see someone behind him, but the room was empty. The voice came again, more urgent this time. "You have awakened something you do not understand. The weapon you hold is not meant for you." Ethan's pulse quickened. The warning felt real, as if the ship itself were alive, watching him, judging him. But he couldn't turn back now. He had come this far, and the truth was within his grasp. Without another word, he reached out and grasped the device. Immediately, the room seemed to shift. The walls warped and twisted, and the floor beneath his feet vibrated with an immense energy. Ethan stumbled back, the device in his hand pulsing with light. He could feel its power coursing through him, surging with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. The air around him crackled as the voice returned, now full of rage. "You do not understand what you have unleashed. You will regret this." The room seemed to collapse in on itself, and Ethan was thrown to the ground. The device slipped from his hand, landing with a loud clang on the cold floor. But the damage had been done. The power of the weapon had connected with the device, and something within the ship had stirred in response. Outside the chamber, he could hear the faint sound of footsteps. Alien soldiers, their heavy boots echoing down the corridor. They were closing in. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, reaching for the weapon. It felt different now, as if it had evolved, grown stronger with the connection to the ancient device. Suddenly, the ship's lights flickered, and a loud mechanical whine filled the air. The ground shook beneath his feet, and Ethan realized that the ship was beginning to power up. The energy he had unleashed was no longer contained. He had triggered something far beyond his comprehension. With no time to lose, Ethan grabbed the weapon and rushed toward the exit. The ship's corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before him, but the footsteps of the aliens were growing louder. They were getting closer. As he sprinted through the dark hallways, the walls began to shift, the symbols on them glowing brighter with each passing second. It was as if the ship itself was reacting to the chaos he had caused. The ancient power he had awakened was no longer just a weapon. It was a living force, and it was beginning to fight back against the invaders. Ethan didn't know if he could outrun them, but he had no choice. The aliens wanted the weapon, and they would stop at nothing to take it from him. But he had something they didn't, the knowledge that the weapon was not just a tool. It was a force that could change everything. The awakening, power beyond comprehension. Ethan's pulse raced as the ship's corridors twisted and turned around him, each step more frantic than the last. The alien footsteps grew louder, echoing ominously through the metallic walls. He could feel their presence closing in, their strange, guttural language drifting through the air. His mind was clouded with thoughts of survival, but the mysterious voice, the one that had warned him against unlocking the power of the ancient weapon, echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain. It was no longer just a warning. It was a prophecy. He could hear the ship groaning beneath him, the structure itself reacting to the energy he had unleashed. It was as though the ancient device had become a living organism, resonating with a force far beyond anything he could comprehend. But one thing was clear. Ethan was no longer just a man fighting for survival. He was the catalyst of something much larger, something far more dangerous. The ship trembled again, and the walls seemed to ripple. The familiar hum that had filled the air now turned into a thunderous roar, as if the ship was coming alive, responding to the immense power surging through it. Every corridor he passed seemed to be shifting, the ship's architecture warping and transforming before his eyes. Behind him, the aliens were drawing closer. He could hear their growls and snarls growing louder, the unmistakable sound of their alien weapons charging up. Panic threatened to take over, but Ethan gritted his teeth, focused on the only thing that mattered: the weapon in his hand. It was no longer just a weapon. It had become an extension of him, its power thrumming through his veins. He had felt it shift in his grip after he had touched the ancient device. The connection between them was undeniable. The weapon was reacting to the ship's transformation, as if it had been waiting for something, waiting for him. The aliens were almost upon him, their footsteps now echoing directly behind him. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, barely catching a glimpse of the alien soldiers, a tall, menacing species with dark, featureless faces and armor that gleamed with a deadly silver sheen. They were fast, their long limbs propelling them effortlessly through the ship's corridors, closing the gap with terrifying speed. He couldn't outrun them. He had to stand his ground. Ethan's hands tightened around the weapon, its unfamiliar energy humming in sync with his heartbeat. A voice, once again, spoke in his mind, but this time it wasn't the same warning from before. This voice was different, more authoritative, more ancient. "Embrace the power, human," it commanded. "Use it wisely, or you will be consumed." The words were clear, and yet they'd made no sense. What power? What was he supposed to do with it? The only thing he understood was that the aliens were closing in, and they would stop at nothing to take the weapon from him. Suddenly, the walls of the ship began to distort. The symbols Ethan had seen earlier on the floor began to glow brighter, their strange markings swirling and pulsating as though they had a life of their own. Ethan's heart pounded as the weapon in his hand began to glow in response, its power reaching a new, unimaginable level. A blinding light filled the corridor. For a moment, Ethan was thrown to the ground, the force of the light overwhelming him. His vision blurred, and his ears rang with a high-pitched frequency that felt like it was coming from inside his skull. The world around him seemed to bend and warp, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Then, everything stopped. The light faded, leaving Ethan kneeling on the cold floor, breathless and dazed. The aliens had stopped in their tracks, their faces filled with confusion and fear. They had not expected this. They had not expected him to be a threat. No human ever had been. But now, everything had changed. Ethan stood slowly, his body still trembling from the power coursing through him. The weapon in his hand seemed to hum with life, its energy vibrating in harmony with his own. The symbols on the walls of the ship had become brighter, their patterns shifting in a way that seemed to respond to his presence. Without a second thought, Ethan raised the weapon and aimed it at the closest alien. The air around him seemed to crackle, the energy from the weapon radiating outward like an invisible force. The alien soldiers hesitated, their movements slow, as if they were sensing the incredible power emanating from him. They had underestimated him. They had mocked him. Now, they were about to pay the price. Ethan's finger hovered over the trigger. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing. He had no choice. The ship, the weapon, the aliens, they were all part of something far greater. And he, Ethan, was at the center of it all. The aliens stepped back, unsure of what to do. They had come to conquer, to take the weapon, to destroy the human who dared challenge them. But they had no idea that by doing so, they had awakened something far more powerful than they could ever imagine. With a sudden, swift movement, Ethan pulled the trigger. The weapon discharged. The blast was deafening. The unleashing. A power beyond control. Ethan's breath came in short gasps, his heart racing as the disintegration of the alien soldiers echoed in the vast expanse of the spaceship. He was surrounded by silence, the aftermath of the battle reverberating through the now quiet corridors. His hand still gripped the ancient weapon, the power surging through him, making his skin tingle with a strange, almost unnatural energy. For a moment, everything seemed still. He couldn't hear the aliens anymore. The ship itself seemed to pause, as though holding its breath. But Ethan knew better than to think the threat was gone. It had only just begun. The ship's walls were now glowing brighter, the strange symbols on them pulsating in rhythm with his heartbeat. The weapon in his hand was no longer just a tool. It was a living thing, an entity that seemed to communicate with him in ways he couldn't fully understand. It thrummed in his palm, almost like a heartbeat of its own, and Ethan could feel the ancient presence within it, the one that had spoken to him earlier, urging him to embrace its power. With a jolt, the ship's systems seemed to come online. A low hum filled the air, and Ethan could feel the vibrations beneath his feet, the sensation of something vast and ancient stirring deep within the bowels of the ship. Something old, something forgotten, was waking. It wasn't just the weapon that had changed. The entire ship seemed to be alive, reacting to Ethan's presence, as if it had been waiting for him. The walls shifted, the corridors twisting and turning as though they were responding to his every move. And in the distance, through the dim glow of the ship's lights, Ethan could make out something that sent a chill down his spine. The aliens had regrouped. The remaining soldiers had managed to retreat to another section of the ship, but they were not alone. Ethan's eyes widened as he saw the figures assembling, a larger, more formidable group of alien warriors. They were unlike the others. Their armor was darker, more intimidating, and their weapons crackled with an energy similar to his own, as if they had been preparing for this very moment. And then, through the throng of soldiers, he saw the leader, towering above the others. Its face was obscured by a helmet, but the aura around it was unmistakable. This was no ordinary alien. This was a commander, an entity of immense power. Ethan could feel the weight of its gaze, even though it was hidden behind the dark visor of its helmet. The alien's presence sent a shock through his body, and for a moment, he questioned if he was truly ready for what lay ahead. But then, a surge of confidence washed over him, fueled by the power of the weapon still humming in his hand. This was his fight now. No longer a helpless human, he had become the harbinger of something much greater. The alien commander raised a hand, and the soldiers around him fell into formation. It was clear they were preparing for something that would either destroy Ethan or finally take the weapon from his hands. But Ethan wasn't going down without a fight. He gritted his teeth and took a step forward, his gaze locked on the commander. The ship continued to groan around him, the walls vibrating with an unseen force, as if the very ship itself was waiting for the battle to unfold. The weapon in his hand glowed brighter, its energy building, swirling like a storm. "You are nothing but a human." The alien commander's voice echoed through the ship, deep and menacing. "You dare challenge us with your primitive power. You have no idea what you've unleashed." Ethan's grip tightened on the weapon, the ancient energy coursing through his veins. He had no idea what he'd unleash, no idea what the weapon could truly do. But what he did know was that the aliens had underestimated humanity. They had laughed at him, mocked him. Now, they would see that they were wrong. He raised the weapon, pointing it at the commander. A deep, resonant hum filled the air as the power inside the weapon continued to grow. The alien soldiers, standing in their perfect formation, began to shift uneasily, their eyes never leaving Ethan. They could sense the change, the shift in the balance of power. And then the commander spoke again, but this time there was something different in its voice, something almost fearful. "You don't know what you're dealing with. The power of the ancients is not meant for you. You will destroy everything if you continue this." But Ethan didn't care. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for his planet, his people, and the future of humanity. With a sudden violent motion, Ethan unleashed the power of the weapon. A brilliant flash of light erupted from the weapon, blinding in its intensity. The force was so powerful, it felt like the very air was being torn apart. The alien soldiers screamed in terror as the energy shot forward, its force unstoppable. The commander raised its weapon in defense, but it was futile. The blast tore through the air, cutting through their defenses with ease. As the light faded, Ethan opened his eyes, his breath heavy with adrenaline. The alien soldiers had been thrown back, their bodies disintegrating into nothingness in the wake of the blast. The ship seemed to quake around him, its systems failing as the ancient power within it surged violently. But there was no time to celebrate. The ship was coming apart, and the alien commander was still standing, just barely. It was clearly wounded, its armor cracked and scorched from the blast. But it was not defeated. Not yet. The commander staggered, its gaze still locked onto Ethan. "You've made a terrible mistake," it growled. "You have no idea what this power truly is." Ethan felt the weight of those words, but he refused to show fear. He had unleashed the power, and he wasn't going to stop now. The final showdown was about to begin. The fate of humanity, of the universe, was on the line. The final stand. The power of humanity. The battle had escalated to a level Ethan could barely comprehend. The ship was shaking violently as the ancient weapon in his hands pulsed with power, its energy now a living thing that seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. He could feel the weapon's power thrumming beneath his fingertips, resonating with the very core of his being. His breath was heavy, his mind racing. The alien commander stood before him, battered but far from defeated. The commander, now towering and furious, raised its shattered weapon with a snarl. "You don't understand, human. You've awakened forces you cannot control. The power of the ancients is beyond anything you can comprehend." Ethan's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure what the commander meant by forces you cannot control, but he knew one thing for sure: the aliens had underestimated him. And they were about to pay the price. The alien commander lunged forward with lightning speed, its weapon crackling with energy. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He raised the ancient weapon, just as the commander swung its blade down. There was a burst of energy, a deafening clash, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Ethan barely managed to block the strike, his arms trembling from the force. The power within him was pushing him to the limit, but he refused to back down. The energy in the weapon surged again, almost as though it was urging him to fight harder, to push forward. It was as if the weapon and Ethan had become one, a single force, ready to face whatever came next. The alien commander's eyes gleamed with hatred, but there was something else there too. Fear. The commander realized, perhaps too late, that this human was no ordinary opponent. Ethan wasn't just wielding an ancient weapon, he had become a part of it. The weapon's power had changed him, and he could feel its effects deep within him. With a swift motion, Ethan pushed the commander back, creating a moment of distance between them. The ship's walls trembled, as if resonating with the building energy. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had to finish this. He had no choice. For Earth. For humanity. The commander growled, charging again, but this time, Ethan was ready. As the commander closed the gap, Ethan unleashed a blast of energy from the ancient weapon. The beam shot out like a wave of pure destruction, hitting the commander square in the chest. The alien's scream echoed through the ship as it was blasted backward, crashing into the ship's control panel. For a moment, it seemed like the commander had been defeated, but Ethan knew better. The fight was far from over. The ship's alarms blared as the force of the blast sent shockwaves through the structure. The ancient ship, alive with the energy of the weapon, seemed to tremble even more violently. Ethan could feel the instability of the ship. It was dying. But he couldn't let that distract him. He had to finish what he started. The commander, bloody but still alive, slowly pulled itself up from the wreckage. It was weak, its armor cracked, but its eyes burned with a fierce determination. "You have no idea what you've done, human," it hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "You've sealed your fate." Ethan's heart pounded, But he wasn't intimidated. The fear in the commander's voice confirmed what he had already suspected. This alien had no idea what was coming next. Humanity had always been underestimated. But this time, the tables had turned. The alien's hand twitched, and Ethan immediately recognized the danger. The commander was preparing something. Some final, desperate strike. The energy in the air seemed to thicken as the commander gathered its strength. But Ethan was faster. He focused all of his energy into the weapon, pushing it to its limits. The weapon hummed louder, its energy becoming almost unbearable, and with a single defiant cry, Ethan unleashed everything he had. The blast that erupted from the weapon was like nothing he had ever experienced before. It was pure, unfiltered destruction, raw power that tore through the ship like a tornado. The very air seemed to crack under its force. The alien commander's eyes widened in shock as the blast hit it square in the chest. The creature was thrown back with incredible force, slamming into the far wall. The ship groaned in protest as the power of the weapon tore through the alien's defenses. Ethan's vision blurred from the intensity of the blast. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He knew the ship was collapsing around him. But he had to make sure the threat was eliminated. The alien commander was still twitching, alive, but barely hanging on. But it was over. The commander's final breath was a rasp, a whisper that barely reached Ethan's ears. "You don't know what you've done." And with that, the commander fell silent, its body going. The ship's alarms blared louder now, a warning that the structure could not survive much longer. Ethan stood there, breathing heavily, the weapon still crackling with energy in his hands. The battle was over, but the cost had been high. The ship was failing, and Ethan knew he had to escape before it was too late. With one final glance at the wreckage of the alien ship, Ethan turned and sprinted toward the escape pod. The ship was crumbling, the walls shaking as if the very bones of the vessel were breaking apart. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: humanity had won this battle. They had fought back, and they had proved that even against overwhelming odds, they could stand their ground. Ethan climbed into the escape pod, activating the launch sequence. The pod's thrusters roared to life, and within moments, he was flying away from the wreckage of the alien ship. As he gazed out the window at the ship's burning remnants, he allowed himself a single victorious smile. Humanity had taken action, and in the end, that was all that mattered.